excellent conference. It's on a series of themes that I've been interested in various ways in my capacity as a sociologist, really. I am primarily a sociologist, but one who is interested in the interface between politics, economics, psychology, personal life, and so on. When I saw the title of this meeting, I thought this sounded like something that I myself would learn a lot from, and have been trying to understand and contribute to in my work in a series of books. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in those books. A lot of what I'm going to say today is drawing on some thinking and some historical analysis that I suppose I've been working on really for over 10 years now. And in some ways it picks up from somewhere Daniel left off about the history of neoliberalism. But the theme that really first drove me to do a PhD was the culture and politics and personal implications of a culture of competition and of competitiveness. And I'm going to link this to neoliberalism in a minute, but I've never had slides which have been granted quite such an impressive position in a room as this, so I'm now rather intimidated by my own backdrop. But I've been interested in various manifestations in cultural and public and personal life, the way in which we are exhorted to be competitors. In the middle of that image, you see the dragon's den. There are the 4 dragons who are deciding whether to invest their venture capital in the competitors who are asking for their business ideas to be developed. Wearable technology, there's a Fitbit on the screen with the slogan, "See if you are competitive." These are wearable technologies that allow us to compare our footsteps and our behaviour and our movement and activity to others. The cities, this was published only earlier this week, saying that Oxford is the most livable city in the UK, and this is something that was compiled by PricewaterhouseCoopers, possibly bringing some of its own ideas about what livability consists of. The bottom left is the table that we academics live in constant fear of, which is the university rankings that consist of various measures and inputs of data concerning student satisfaction, graduate student retention, and so on, and all these other types of measures. And that bus is an Adidas advert from the when was the previous World Cup? 2014 World Cup, with a picture of Mesut Ozil, the German footballer, with the slogan "Hunt or be hunted." And these are the sorts of images and the sorts of sentiments and sources of compulsion that we're used to living around amongst nowadays. And many of these things are things that we engage in voluntarily. We don't necessarily have to care about football or watch the Dragon's Den, let alone participate in the Dragon's Den. It's not necessarily something that universities can get out of, these sorts of tables. But there is also a culture of what you might call punitive competitiveness. And these are some quotes taken from welfare to work schemes from the last 6 years. Daniel mentioned about how the key moment in American welfare reform was Bill Clinton's 1996 reform that turned welfare into a form of workfare, a way of trying to activate people to become more serious about their job seeking. Those quotes on the left are from an excellent paper that I recommend called Positive Affect as Coercion by Lynn Friedley and Robert Stern. But you can see from those quotes, these are things that people who are enrolled in an A4E job-seeking program, this A4E is or was a private sector workfare contractor that would receive money from the Department of Work and Pensions to try and make people more employable. But these are things that people were compelled to recite as they were participating in a particular type of what was called behavioural activation program. This article in Open Democracy, which is well worth reading, was written by someone who had participated in one of these sorts of schemes and has the immortal line. I sat with 10 other unemployed people being told that we needed to, quote, talk, breathe, eat, shit, believe in yourself, and being compared to an iPhone. So this idea that the problem of unemployment is fundamentally a lack of energy and a lack of desire and competitiveness on the part of people who might be applying for hundreds and hundreds of jobs without success is something that has become one of the uglier aspects of contemporary neoliberalism. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, there are various things I want to just flag up about these examples right at the outset before turning to how I understand this as an ideology. The first thing is that this is not just about the market. None of these instances necessarily, of course, there's the labour market hovering in the background of the workfare schemes, but the market is a space of transactions. And also a market is a space which various people can live side by side. In the original ideal of the market, as proposed by the likes of Adam Smith, the market was a place of coexistence. So I make bread, you make candlesticks, and we trade and we live together quite happily. Secondly, these competitions are staged in various ways. They involve quite a lot of planning. They involve judges, audiences, coaches, and so on. They proceed through a fear of elimination. What is ultimately at stake is whether or not one is going to prosper and survive, or whether one is going to be eliminated. And they cultivate a spirit of competitiveness, but a mood of anxiety. And this is what I wanted to talk about today, is the way in which some of these sorts of cultures and policies and practices impact upon people personally. So in terms of what I want to, the kind of outline of what I'm going to talk about over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, first of all I want to just return briefly to how I understand neoliberalism, which is not going to go into as much detail as Daniel did, but will build quite directly on some of what he said, but primarily about neoliberalism as the planning of competition. Secondly, talk a bit about audit as a particular type of trial that surrounds us increasingly in a neoliberal society, and I think that's what a lot of the themes of this meeting are concerned with. And then finally, just try and identify some of the personal consequences of this. And Farad mentioned some of the books that I've written in the past, and a lot of what I'm going to say is drawing, well, quite a lot on the first of these books, The Limits of Neoliberalism, which was an attempt to try and understand the way in which neoliberal politics and ideology elevates competition to the central organising principle of not just markets, but also organisations and of society. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that is. The other books, which I've also touched on this, but really in the happiness industry I'm concerned mostly with the question of how different forms of affect, particularly positive affect, have been used to govern us, to sell things to us, to discipline us, but crucially always depends on the idea that affect and the mind are quantifiable entities or measurable entities, starting with the ideas of Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, and then right up to some of the things that you'll all be very familiar with, such as the rise of CBT in recent years, and efforts to try and put monetary values on interventions such as CBT, which is really how that piece of work began, was with a curiosity that the ways in which someone like Richard Layard back in the early 2000s managed to convince the government of the merits of CBT was by his ability to build what in Whitehall is called a business case for it. And then finally, my most recent book, Nervous States, which is about lots of things, but it's particularly about this particular populist moment, and linking it to the problem of living in a society which is increasingly understands itself in real-time terms, that is via real-time media and via an economy that is always on, via social media and forms of feedback that are kind of unrelenting, making it much, much harder to achieve forms of objectivity, forms of fact-based discourse, forms of more stable forms of authority due to the constant churn of data, media, and economic entities and so on. Now, in terms of the philosophy of neoliberalism, this is going to be my rather rough and ready characterization of a philosophy. I wouldn't necessarily call it an ideology, because I think that it does need to be understood. It is an ideology, but I want to talk about it as much as anything as a way of understanding what human societies consist of, what it means to be a human being. And the first feature of it, I would suggest, and we can trace this in particular texts and ideas and so on, but there is a Darwinist strand to it. I wouldn't necessarily say that all neoliberals would call themselves Darwinists or cite Darwin. There was a particular influence of social Darwinism, of Spencer and others from the late 19th century. But fundamentally, human beings are not all naturally equal from a neoliberal perspective, according to my characterization of this as a philosophy. This is very different from liberalism. For liberals, the whole way back to Thomas Hobbes, through Immanuel Kant, right up to people like John Rawls in the present and so on, human beings have some common human characteristic. That might be the ability to work in the form of, in the work of someone like John Locke, or it might be the capacity to reason in the thoughts of someone like Immanuel Kant, or it might be the capacity to fear in the work of Thomas Hobbes. But fundamentally, from a liberal perspective, human beings have to be understood first and foremost in terms of what makes them human in common. Neoliberals start from the premise that we all have rather different types of capacities, and these are things that lead some of us to become leaders and entrepreneurs, and some of us to become followers. But human beings do not all have the same types of capabilities. Secondly, there is a fundamental problem of relativism, a problem that in the history of philosophy finds its sort of first articulation, I suppose, in the ideas of Nietzsche in the late 19th century, and becomes a problem of sociology as much as anything else during the 20th century, that the fundamental crisis of modernity from the late 19th century onwards is that we have no common standards of value, we have no common ways of agreeing what is ultimately valuable about human life, and that this represents a deep political and cultural crisis that potentially leads to conflict. There is a way of dealing with this, but it is a dangerous way of dealing with this, and that way of dealing with it is socialism, or planning of some kind. The enforcement, the imposition of forms of equality and of shared values upon societies that are fundamentally shaped by unequal capabilities and relative ideas of value and of a good life. But socialists will not tolerate this relativism. They have no way of, they impose the values of the elite, of the intellectuals, of the planner upon the mass in some way. This is what people like Friedrich Hayek were most afraid of, was that socialism, and this could include any form of mild social democracy, would eventually turn into something like this, that involves centralised experts, elites and intellectuals and fundamentally snobs who would say that I know what is a good way of life and I'm going to determine that and make it available to everyone in the form of an education curriculum or forms of social goods and so on. So the neoliberal project, for me, involves a turn towards the state, and Daniel mentioned at the end about how important the state is from a neoliberal perspective. The state, part of the role of the state is to release and reveal the forms of inequality that are tacit and which socialist interventions and plans and forms of organisation threaten to repress, and to help what are underlying forms of inequality to come to light. The state must be seized and repurposed away from a welfare state towards a state that will enable inevitable and underlying inequalities to become plain in society, and to allow the good to rise to the top and the less good to find their natural place in some kind of hierarchy. So the ideal is of a type of naturally but politically enabled hierarchy that emerges in an emergent fashion. And this, if you think back to those slogans that were being recited by the A4E participants and this form of workfare, this is the type of role for the state that is, I think, ultimately implicit in quite some of the early neoliberal writings, is of a state that coaches, nudges, stands back, but occasionally intervenes to encourage people to explore their full capabilities, so that the full energies and the full diversities of different levels of energy will become clear. There is, I think, a very important danger that preoccupies many of the neoliberals that needs to be understood properly if we're to understand the forms of audit and managerialism and the obsession with measurement that we see around us today. Daniel mentioned earlier George Stigler, best known for his work on deregulation, Milton Friedman. Daniel discussed particularly in relation to monetarism, but they also dabbled in various forms of philosophy, about philosophy necessarily, but they had their various theories as to why markets were desirable entities. And I think that by understanding the case they made for the market, the social, political, philosophical case they made for the market, we can also start to see the ways in which numbers and audit are valorized in neoliberal societies. And you can see that Milton Friedman was a deep political pessimist, fundamentally. That quote at the top, "Over values men can ultimately only fight." He believed that if it came down to questions about different ideas of how to live, different notions of virtue, that because of the, I suppose, tragic relativism bordering on nihilism of modernity, that if it came down to a question of whether this is the right way to live or that is the right way to live, that this is a condition really of conflict, which is a very miserable idea of the potential of human language, of democracy, of politics. You could say that having lived through the 1930s and World War II, witnessing ways in which democracy and politics could turn very dark, that perhaps this has become more understandable. But really this is, I would argue, fundamentally a pessimistic view of what language can do. That it is not articulated like this in Friedman's work necessarily, but the fear is that dialogue, reason and logic is powerless to overcome some of the types of difference and disagreement that human beings have. And there's, I think, a very helpful indicative quote from George Stigler there, which shows that the case for the market is as much phenomenological as anything else. It is the fact that markets make their costs and their benefits, and they make preferences and values explicit and clear and public and transparent, that makes them desirable basis for social and political life. Because it's precisely that threat that if we go around with different ideas of how to live in our heads, and we're not entirely clear about it, we might reach misunderstanding, and that ultimately we'll either end up in conflict with each other, or we'll need some kind of patrician socialist welfare state to come in and impose some kind of order on us. But what is the genius of the market is that it makes values and calculations and choices explicit. It lays the cards face up on the table. Competition, I think, is the panacea in the neoliberal ideology. It is what resolves the various crises, not just of capitalism, but of modernity more generally, of those problems of relativism, those problems of ambiguity and that threat of conflict. Competition will resolve these things. Now, we can talk about what is meant by competition, but competitions, I think, we need to think through what are the different virtues that competitions have from a neoliberal perspective. Hayek has a nice paper from the 1950s or early 1960s called Competition as a Discovery Procedure. Competition is a process, it's a movement through which we go, at the end of which we have discovered something that we didn't know at the beginning. This is similar actually to how someone like his friend and compatriot Karl Popper understood how science works, is that in order for science to work, you have to throw together lots of incompatible facts and claims, and at the end only one will be left standing, and that one is the truth. So you discover the truth through some kind of falsification of error. And so competitions have this very positive virtue that they discover that which is of value, whether it be a product, a good, a service, an individual, a Dragon's Den contestant, a university, a football team, a city, whatever else I had on that slide. But they are ways of discovering that which is of value. By finding winners, they also identify value. Now this has the added quality of inculcating a certain type of subjectivity, it draws on the energies of individuals. It turns people into active entrepreneurial figures who are striving for the best outcome for themselves. There's a scholar and historian of neoliberalism called Werner Bonefeld, who talks about how the ordoliberals that Daniel mentioned at one point were engaged in a project of what Bonefeld calls deproletarianization. That is, trying to take the mass and turn them from people who kind of experience unemployment passively and then go in search of some kind of benefit to live off, into something other than a proletariat, into something that is active, entrepreneurial, vital is a term that Bonefeld uses a lot for that. Competitions have a disciplinary effect. They eliminate waste and failure. In the same way that they identify success, they push failure, inefficiency, weakness out. Competition in the National Health Service, which doesn't necessarily work through markets, a lot of it's through quasi-markets, is justified on this basis, that if you don't have competition, you're going to have waste, you're going to have inefficiency, you're going to have people taking too many sick days off work and this sort of thing. So competition is the way of cutting the fat, effectively, and in a literal sense, when you're talking about sport and wearable technology and this sort of thing. Crucially, competitions not only are compatible with a form of cultural and value pluralism, they actually prosper through value and cultural pluralism. Competitions are more vibrant and more successful in their discovery process when more different ideas of how to live, different ideas of a good product, a good service, a good individual, a good way of life are factored in. And they don't tell you how to play them. This is what the genius of the entrepreneur, from a neoliberal perspective, is that if you're Jeff Bezos, you don't turn up in the book market and set up a bookshop and think, how can I become a better bookshop? You try and destroy the book market. You come up with a completely different way of being a book retailer until barely any other book retailers can survive. This is actually, Bezos deserves his trillions because he has spotted something that nobody else in that competition was able to spot. And he's now the richest man in the world. They have a particular idea of authority that underpins them, competitions. They don't involve the potentially tyrannical form of authority that Hayek feared in socialism or even in mild social democracy, which tells people what kind of education they should have, what kind of healthcare they should have, what kinds of goods would be desirable for all, such as houses and so on. Authority becomes purely formal. It becomes purely like a sort of referee. The referee in a game of football doesn't have a view on who should win, or they certainly shouldn't, that would be corruption. The referee is purely there to oversee that the game is played in the most vigorous and fair way possible. So authority becomes purely focused upon an empty enforcement of the rules in various ways, and ultimately has no preference as to what the outcome will be. One way of understanding what a competition is, at least in its ideal form, is that contestants are formally equal at the beginning and empirically unequal at the end. So you go in in a sort of a priori sense, as having the same possibilities of winning, and at the end only one, or unless it's a draw, but that's an unknown outcome. But it has the discovery process is overseen by virtue of the fact that the referee is acting purely formally. But crucially, competition is not inevitable. This is a very important feature of this philosophy or ideology. And it's very different again from what liberals such as Adam Smith believed. Adam Smith, a very famous line from The Wealth of Nations of 1776, is that mankind has a natural tendency to truck, barter and exchange. So Smith believed that what he was spotting in market society was something that human beings have a natural tendency to do. The great fear that neoliberalism is founded on is that although human beings may all have some inner natural inequalities in terms of their capacity to lead and to disrupt and to compete and so on, but there wasn't anything that would naturally arise about competition. Competition wouldn't simply kind of come over the hill to our rescue purely by force of nature or God or anything like that. It was up to authorities, politicians and managers to ensure that people were competing. Competition has to become obligatory in some way, otherwise people have a tendency to do things like form trade unions and join collective entities and cooperate and so on, which has various dangers. So you need a particular type of authority, a particular type of political agent who is going to enforce competition inside markets, because antitrust was one of the preoccupations, particularly of the early neoliberals in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. They were obsessed with competition policy as a way of trying to ensure that the market held its natural form. One of the interpretations of the rise of National Socialism in Germany by the German neoliberals was precisely that the German economy had too many cartels, it was too corporatized, and that this was partly what enabled the National Socialists to take over the economy. And so antitrust was initially kind of a fixation of various people, both in the European and American side. They became less and less concerned by it as they realized that actually large corporations might actually be beneficial in certain ways from the sort of 70s onwards. But crucially, the area where you need to enforce competition most strongly is outside the market. Markets usually can work more or less okay left to their own devices, but outside the market is where people start to seek out forms of equality, cooperation and solidarity in various ways that represses competition. So new public management has already been mentioned a few times, but the enforcement of competitiveness and target-oriented governance in the public sector, health services, and so on. The testing in schools, which has become, I think, is reaching crisis point now, where there was a recent the data collection in schools and the impact on children's mental health in relation to testing, the ways in which teachers are now suffering from the constant need to be measured themselves in terms of children's outcomes and scores and so on, but also the valorisation of competitive sport in all circumstances has become something that I think is seen as being a way of inculcating a certain set of values rather than another set of values, because values themselves, the culture of capitalism, is not something that can be left to its own devices from a neoliberal perspective. I've already mentioned the ranking, the auditing, the compulsion to participate in various forms of league table and so on. I mean, as an academic, this is something that we have regular discussions of. Sometimes it sounds internally about how to, universities are studying different newspapers' league tables, studying their methodologies, trying to work out what they need to do in order to improve according to particular indicators and so on, so as to try and push themselves up these league tables. We had a visit this week at my university from someone who works in a school saying that the league tables are pinned all over the walls of the secondary school where he works, and that is the way in which children are encouraged to go and choose a university. Customer feedback, something that is used increasingly to discipline people who are not being competitive enough in various ways. And again, as an academic, it's student satisfaction is the form of feedback that we have to focus on the whole time. Not always, I think sometimes quite legitimately. There are some areas where I think it does quite a lot of good, but there are also lots of areas where it diverts attention towards things that universities were really never set up to do in the first place. So I want to talk a bit about, how am I doing for time, by the way? Okay, cool. I want to talk a bit about how audit works and try to think through the role of numbers in social and political and organisational life, drawing on some of the sociology of this. There is actually now quite an extensive sociology of quantification and measurement and so on. And I'll also touch on some of my own work that I've done on trying to think through the different ways in which audit changes. Now, as the Stigler quote from earlier, the market lays the cards face up on the table. The challenge for reform of bureaucracies, organisations, professions, the social world, but also things like the arts as well, is worth thinking about here as well, is to make these things market-like, not necessarily by introducing an actual price mechanism, because a price mechanism involves an act of exchange. It's not necessarily the case. If you're inside an organisation, it's unlikely you're going to be buying and selling goods, but to make them market-like, to take on some of the qualities of the market, some of the positive qualities of the market that otherwise are absent. And that, I think, first and foremost, is about introducing something that lays the cards face up on the table, as Stigler put it. And we know how these sorts of things work by and large, but the first thing is to create proxies for value. What the genius of markets is that they automatically generate a proxy for value, and that proxy is called price. From a market perspective, if a book is £20 or £10, it reflects the value of the book in a perfectly proportionate fashion. One is worth twice as much as the other. The market has a very imperfect, but nevertheless a very clear way of linking proxy to value, price to value. And we have to go around inventing new types of proxy in the age of audit. And this is something that generates all sorts of rather unsatisfactory outcomes, but things like customer satisfaction scores, student satisfaction, ways of, in the business world, in relation to things like innovation, there is also things like innovation policy, using things like the amount of patenting that goes on as a way of, as a proxy for how innovative a given community is, and so on. So, the invention of new proxies for value, tests, the creation of new tests to establish how much progress is being made in a school or whatever it might be. And of course you hear of the absurd sort of gaming that goes on in areas such as the NHS, where it is decided that a proxy for value is how many beds are available across a given night or something like that. I don't know, you hear of these rather sort of absurd, reductio ad absurdum type situations where hospitals are actually doing things that are completely unconducive to improving the medical care they're providing, but purely because they are playing towards a given proxy for what is considered to be the value of health care. Secondly, to count what is countable. So of course we all count an increasing number of things. The rise of wearable technology that I mentioned earlier, where you can now count your footsteps, you can count all sorts of things, but simply counting things becomes a way of trying to create the explicitness that the market has, but the non-market doesn't have. And one of the things that the sociology of quantification has done in the work of people like Ted Porter, his book Trust in Numbers, that is what I'm citing here, does, is to show that actually, eventually, numbers themselves start to take on a type of rhetorical and cultural quality where the mere invoking of numbers is a sort of proxy for credibility and authority. And of course we hear this all over the place when politicians go on the radio and they rattle off numbers and so on, and that just merely speaking in a numerical and quantitative fashion becomes a way of signalling that one is someone to be taken seriously, that one is willing to view the world objectively, that one is keeping one's own personal views or politics out of things. And that the culture of numbers and the ethos of speaking quantitatively becomes its own type of political rhetoric and political authority. I would add on that, I think that in terms of thinking about through something like Brexit, I think that those who allowed numbers to become the lingua franca of democracy, which is something that has been developing for a long time, but I think really the political class for the last 20, 30 years were very sort of complacent about. The fact that the public then wasn't immediately concerned when George Osborne and co said that Brexit would harm British GDP, they might want to reflect on the ways in which GDP had been used to try and bludgeon people with previous political arguments and so on. So there is a kind of a breaking away of numbers from reality that eventually occurs once audit becomes, rather than a way of trying to hold up an objective mirror to reality, instead becomes an intervention that works through anxiety, through fear, through intimidation, and through political interventions that are not always welcome. So it's not clear after a while that audits are actually generating facts, or whether they are trying to cultivate a type of culture of anxiety. One of my own pieces of work that I'm just going to mention in passing in case it's of interest, because I think it does speak to some of the kind of concerns here. It's an article I had published in the New Left Review a couple of years ago, but was trying to kind of spot the precise implications of the financial crisis for the culture of neoliberalism as it's emerged over the last decade. And the argument that I make in the paper is that there was this phase that Daniel's mentioned of the 1990s, the third way, the kind of happy golden era of neoliberalism, I suppose, of the what you could call the long 1990s, of effectively between the end of socialism and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, where audit flooded the social, political and artistic sectors, education sectors, but it did so in a spirit of generosity in certain respects, so that if you were an artist in the late 90s, or running an art scheme, or if you were working in social services or in the NHS and so on, part of the deal of receiving additional funding from a very fiscally generous state, as it was, particularly during the New Labour second term, was that you were willing to measure. Measurement was a condition of a gift of some kind. So measurement, if you were willing to put numbers on things, if you're willing to say how many people have come to your concert, or if you're willing to count all the things that those in Whitehall want counting, that the fiscal beneficence, the generosity of the surpluses would continue to flow in your direction. And I think that that's partly how the legitimation of this phase of audit and of quantification and measurement worked, was that its explosion, and there were books by people like Mike Power at LSE called The Audit Explosion and this sort of thing. A lot of it, Risk Society was the other kind of overarching concept that was used to describe this phase of the long 1990s. But it coincided with a period of growth. When you look back on the history of capitalism, if that ever happens, we will see that the sort of 89 to 2008 period was one of those exceptional phases of prosperity and relative stability and peace. And it was justified, the distribution of those surpluses, on the basis that people would measure themselves. And people, to measure oneself in exchange for additional funding feels very different from what has happened since 2008, which is the spirit of what I call punitive neoliberalism, which is much more about the identification of who will be eliminated, who will be the loser. When the tide is coming in, things feel quite different from when the tide is going out. The role of numbers today, at a time when money is being withdrawn from various projects, various social goods, universities, public services and so on, is that numbers become a way of trying to eliminate, to identify the loser, well, ultimately the logic of austerity. And I think that it's worth reflecting on how the status and the ethos and the aesthetic of a number changes when it is in those two different kind of fiscal eras. There has been an explosion of a new type of rancor. Glad I pronounced that one. Richard Florida, with his cities index, measuring the creative class in different cities. The World Economic Forum, which measures different national competitiveness of different economies around the world. As universities, we live in fear of the ultimate one is the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. The Ofsted, obviously, is what oversees the measurement and auditing of schools. And these types of consultancy organisation, credit rating agencies, that were absolutely the key elements in the formation of how the financial crisis played out, was to give scores to the financial instruments that eventually brought down the whole global economy. And these agencies, such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, the big four companies of PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, and whichever the other one is, but which was behind that cities index that I mentioned at the very beginning. Now, what I think is interesting about these new sources of knowledge, these new sources of authority, is they sit in this particular space that is neither university nor state nor a conventional type of business either. They aspire to a type of authority that I think is absolutely key to the way in which neoliberalism works, which is a type of authority that has that kind of formality about it, that formal quality, which is the ability to compare in a spirit of apparent non-ethical, purely formal type of comparison on the basis of numbers, so that they have an air of technocracy about them, an air of mathematical credibility about them, that they are speaking from a position that has neither the risks of the state that the neoliberals what feared that the socialist state would develop, nor do they bring any of the kind of ideological risks that universities bring with them. I mean, we're now seeing, I think, what can only really be described as a type of cultural war that is being aimed against universities, particularly in the humanities, cultural studies, areas such as gender studies and so on, across various democracies at the moment. It's happening in Australia has now introduced a new criterion that research proposals will be evaluated in how well they serve the national interest, whatever the national interest is. That's quite different perhaps from the public interest. But that what has developed in tandem with the rise of neoliberalism, and in some ways offering, I think, a kind of a replacement for the forms of intellectual, epistemological authority of universities, is this particular type of ranking organisation that is sits seemingly outside of politics because they're dealing purely in forms of numerical comparison. There has also been, and I think this is crucial to understanding, and in some ways this is partly about the kind of nervous states that I'm talking about in my book, but this idea of constant, always-on, real-time auditing that I think has really something we can trace back to the last decade or so, with the rise of particularly of smartphones, social media platforms, and so on, but which is the pushing of an auditory mentality into various areas of social, personal, private life, where previously they simply couldn't reach because the technologies were not available to do so. And just to kind of go through these examples, I mean, this Ofsted example I think is rather frightening. It's an experiment at the moment, I'm not quite sure where it's got to, but the idea is that in cooperation with the government's nudge unit, that's something that some of you have probably heard of, there would be an experiment in machine learning to scrape data from various social media sources and other message boards and this sort of thing, to try and pick up a sign that there was a problem with a school via the various online sentiments that are being expressed by parents, teachers, or whatever it might be. Now, of course, if that picks up that a school has some fundamental problem, you say, well, what could be wrong with that? But I think that what this signifies above all is the way in which the culture of audit and of ranking and of measurement is being pushed into, it's becoming something that starts to at least feel like it has a 24/7 quality to it, so that it's something that doesn't let up. It's not something that has the ritual of audit. One of Mike Power's books on audit is called Rituals of Verification. It's about the way in which audit historically was something that happened with a particular rhythm to it, a bit like how companies declare their profits on a quarterly basis to a stock market or something like this. Where audit becomes something that is always on, all the time, everywhere, that starts to take on a different quality to it, and not knowing how one is being judged, or when one is being judged, or by whom one is being judged. Some of the other examples, I mean, the TripAdvisor occasionally gets into these controversies to do with people, you know, businesses that have been ruined by various customers deciding to kind of gang up on them and this sort of thing. And the fear of living with the customer feedback that can be constantly appear at any time. Instagram likes as a way of actually sort of, that's the red button at the bottom, you know, people reorganising their holidays or selecting their pets or whatever it might be, so as to thinking already in terms of how much feedback, positive feedback they might get on Instagram. One of the most frightening things on this slide that you can't see because it's too small, but that series of boxes in the middle is the patent that Facebook has filed, or it's a bit of a patent that Facebook has filed for a credit rating algorithm, which effectively would turn Facebook into a way of deciding the creditworthiness of users on the basis of the behaviour and identities of their friends. So that effectively, as you're engaging with these platforms and these social networks, you are leaving all sorts of data about yourself which will enable your value, your worth, your position in the pecking order, which is this key concern of the neoliberal mindset, which is to identify where one is in the hierarchy, as we go about our day-to-day lives, we are leaving a trail of data that is positioning us in ways that we may never actually be aware of, but it's something that we become distantly conscious of. So there are some quite obvious personal consequences to all of this. I want to just briefly end by going through some of the how I think that we can think about this on a more personal and psychological level, although I'm sure all of you have witnessed some of the kind of implications of this in terms of your own work and so on. But there is at the core of neoliberalism, Gary Becker is one of the most important Chicago school economists of the sort of late Chicago period from the 1960s onwards. This is from his Nobel Prize-winning lecture of 1992. Gary Becker has given us the term human capital, a term that has done a great deal for the reform of higher education in this country over the last 15 years, 20 years or so. But he says, in human capital theory, people rationally evaluate the benefits and costs of activities such as education, training, expenditures on health, migration, formation, habits. And I think the bit which is interesting here is that radically alter the way they are. The implication is that if we think of ourselves as forms of capital, the question always arises as to where we should invest that capital and how we should invest that capital. If if we think of ourselves as a bundle of future possibilities, first of all, what is capital? Capital is something that you can invest in and which in the future pays some kind of return. It is necessarily a temporal phenomenon. It's something that it's not like markets are synchronous technologies. They now allow me to exchange something with you in the here and now. Capital is a diachronic phenomenon. It's something whose value involves its ability to pay returns in the future. So to treat something as capital is to see it as something that can be invested, and at some point down the line will have some kind of payback of some kind, or maybe a negative payback, but nevertheless it is a type of debt, it is a type of investment that brings certain risks and so on. And this is the foundation of the neoliberal idea of what a human being fundamentally is. And Michel Foucault, who gave these very famous lectures on neoliberalism, publishes The Birth of Biopolitics in 1978-79. Amazingly prescient, because few people had really ever heard of these people back in 1978-79. But he says that if we read Gary Becker, we need to understand that under neoliberalism, every human being is, in Foucault's words, an entrepreneur of the self. So the self itself becomes something that is malleable, can be divested from one set of engagements and can be reinvested in another set of engagements. But the key property of this self, the key the key possession of this self, I suppose, is time. It's not that every self is rich or powerful or particularly well capitalized in financial terms, but they have time. They have the ability to decide how to use their time, and so they can decide whether to engage in education, they can decide whether to engage in cognitive behavioral therapy, they can decide whether to move to a different city or to engage in a particular relationship. And all of these things are types of investment in their own personal capital, because as an entrepreneur, and an entrepreneur doesn't have to be a rich person or one of the Dragon's Dens or Jeff Bezos from this perspective. If each of us is an entrepreneur of the self, then we have the ability to divest from one life course and reinvest in another life course. And this produces what you could call the tyranny of return on investment. The idea that every activity has a logic to it that will become clear in terms of its future payback. So the value of an activity is rarely to be established purely in the here and now. It's to be linked, rather like a type of financial investment plan or a business plan or whatever it might be, to some type of return on that investment that will come in the future. So this is, I would argue, an existentialist philosophy fundamentally. It's a question of who do I want to be such that in the future, what do I want to do now, what choice do I want to make now, such that in the future I will be the person who I believe I can become. Again, there is, I think, a question about trying to release a type of flourishing that a planned or socialist or egalitarian society will repress, but can be released in when people are exhorted to become entrepreneurs. So university, one of the justifications, the government keeps adding more justifications to suggest they don't know why the hell they're doing it, but one of the justifications why universities have fees now of over £9,000 a year is because of the way graduates earn more money. And one of the things, only yesterday I saw Sam Giemer, the university's minister, has released his app, which he is very proud of, which tells you, with some sort of magical crystal ball, because most economists would say this is not possible to do, but tells you how much money you'll be earning in 5 years' time if you go to University X and course X rather than University Y and course Y, which is, I would love to know what I will be earning in 5 years' time, so maybe Giemer's app can do that. But that is the logic that they are trying to inculcate, is to think, well, yes, I can go and study English at University of East Anglia, and in 5 years' time I will be earning this much, or I can study marketing at a different university and I'll be earning this much more. So the future, in that sense, is a series of returns on investment. CBT, I mentioned earlier, I mean, part of my first interest in the happiness industry was the way in which Richard Layard had constructed an economic case, Richard Layard being the economist who has done probably more than anyone to put happiness onto the government's health and well-being and economic agenda, but showing that public investment in 8 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy for someone who is depressed and unemployed will ultimately save the exchequer money, rather than having them claiming unemployment benefits and not getting back into the labour market, so that he demonstrates that it has a positive return on investment. Relationships, the notion of social capital, become things that can be engaged in with a view to some type of future return. I mean, that is ultimately what the ideal of networking is. If you talk about a networking event, it's the idea that you are building up, you're making investments, and so on. And of course, entrepreneurs, if you go to an entrepreneur's club or a freelancing organisation or something like that, this is almost explicit. This is how friendship and connectivity should work. But in the age of the wearable technology and quantified self, as it's known, I think one of the rather more worrying aspects of this, I recently read this wonderful book that's coming out by Josh Cohen, a psychoanalyst, called Not Working, Why We Have to Stop, and I think it's out in January, and I strongly recommend it, but it's really about the inability to preserve spaces of genuine sort of, well, I don't know what the word, I was going to say nothing, it's not nothing, but the passage of time as being something that isn't generating some kind of outcome, that isn't a form of activity, that can be just lazy or slothful or and so on. And I think that one of the more pernicious ways in which the Silicon Valley ideology has encroached into our personal and private and physical lives is the sense in which everything from sleep to relaxation to things like meditation and mindfulness are rebooting exercises. And this is partly to do with the cognitive theory of the mind that is so powerful within Silicon Valley, and it's effectively saying that something like sleep or mindfulness is, have you tried switching it off and switching it back on again as a way of trying to re-energize the mind. Excellence becomes a kind of nonsense eventually, and it's worth always remembering, and I have to remember this so as to sort of stay sane or to understand the insanity going on around me of academia. That excellence is a relativist term. To excel doesn't mean to be good, it means to stand out from the others. So it's actually to turn excellence into the final virtue and teleology of society is to sort of, it's not really to ever get you anywhere that you want to be, it's merely to be standing out from the others that one is competing with. And there's this wonderful nonsense from Michael Gove when he was education minister, where he said that he thought that all pupils should be above average. Below that are the criteria that we as academics are forced to use to rank each other's work for the research excellence framework that happens every 7 years, and which we are beginning to start worrying about at the moment because it's coming up in 2020. But I think what's interesting about the different qualities that are assigned to different work is that there is no, I mean, something like good or average or acceptable is no longer acceptable. And it's the same with Ofsted ratings, that people will say that acceptable is not an acceptable level of attainment for a school. And once you enter into a point where your language can no longer make any sense, you realise that something is beginning to sort of fall apart. Now, one of the most famous pieces of management literature from the last 40 years is Tom Peters and Rob Waterman's In Search of Excellence. So excellence becomes the kind of cult, but it's excellence, just to stress that it is a relative term. Excellence is a term that tells people that they have not achieved something such as virtue or goodness or justice or a kind of any kind of absolute form of quality, but are standing out from others. And again, we have these rather sort of nonsensical discussions sometimes as academics about whether a 70 should be excellent and an 80 should be outstanding and a 90 should be exceptional, and then it's sort of you realise all these terms basically mean the same thing. And it's this sort of obsession with identifying that which stands out. Now this has, I think we could say quite clearly that it's not a coincidence. This isn't the way in which neoliberalism has run into the sand. Of course, it's with the financial crisis, which was a epic problem of deregulation and hubris on the part of the financial sector and so on. But the neoliberalism has run into certain psychic limits, that the demands that this philosophy and ideology place on people become ultimately too much. I just want to kind of finish by just identifying how we can understand some of these. One of the great problems with this, even success, is contingent, short-term, and relative. Excellence is something that is temporary. As part of my PhD that turned into my book on neoliberalism, I interviewed various competitiveness gurus like the man from Florida I mentioned earlier and others, and they would always say, well, being number one is not enough. You've got to think about, when you're number one, you've got to think about how do I stay number one. And this sort of, it's also when you hear professional sports people who have just won something and they get asked, how are you going to celebrate? And the answer is always, well, I'm not going to rest on my laurels. That's always, it's like, well, you can't even celebrate for one night. I always used to admire the cricketers who would sort of, actually kind of enjoy, have a bit of a party after they won something. And nowadays they just go straight back to the gym. So it's sort of sense that even success is something that cannot be taken for granted. And I think that one of the things that people are grappling with when thinking about Donald Trump's success is, well, lots of rich people voted for Donald Trump, and lots of successful and economically comfortable people voted for Donald Trump. And that's true. It wasn't just the white working class left behind of cliche. But one of the most common psychological attributes of Trump voters was what the psychologists who did the study call relative deprivation, a feeling that others are getting ahead of them, a feeling that one is being left behind relative to one's peers. And if you look at the distribution of income in the US economy, they're right, because actually inequality becomes more extreme the further you go up the economic spectrum. So if you're at the 90th percentile, towards the top, everyone ahead of you is getting richer faster than you. If you're at the 99th percentile, clear as the top, everyone above you is getting richer faster than you. So that sense that others are constantly pulling away faster than you is something that is not simply about those who seem to be kind of objectively left behind, but has a psychological property. Reserves of energy to compete, to desire, to improve, act, eventually run out. That rhetoric of sort of the World Economic Forum and of Ofsted and so on, of constantly improving, constant positivity and exertion, well, leading to exhaustion, becomes eventually runs out. And this, I think, has to be seen in a relationship to the way in which depression has been transformed over the last 50 years or so. There is the best sociology of depression I've read is a book called The Weariness of the Self by Alain Ehrenberg, a French sociologist, and that is really about how depression over the course of between the 1960s and the 1980s starts to manifest itself increasingly as a form of exhaustion or deflation, or just simply, I can't any longer. And he links that in a sociological way to the culture that is as much to do with the 1960s, admittedly, of a culture of individual flourishing and fulfillment and growth, but also particularly to the rise of a neoliberal policy regime which valorises competition and entrepreneurship in all its forms. Entrepreneurial responsibility, well, it is responsibility, but it turns into a form of recrimination, a form of self-blame. I mean, those A4E mantras that people read out are really, I mean, some of them are quite cruel, some of them are quite punitive, saying, you know, the only person who can stop you is you, which, of course, for many people, most people, unless you're sort of, you know, completely unconstrained human being, whoever that might be, that is simply just not a statement of fact. But it is cultivating something that begins as an invitation to try, to use efforts, to engage and to desire, but can ultimately start to manifest itself as a form of self-recrimination. I think that if you think about what human capital ultimately means, as someone like Gary Becker developed it, for Becker, the point is that we all have time that we can use, and we choose to use it. We choose whether to spend it with our children, or spend it engaged in training, or spend it changing our appearance or something like this. But this is an extremely pernicious and all-engulfing, and in some ways rather totalitarian ideology, because it means that there is no time that is ever outside of this logic. And I would suggest, this is really just a sort of lay observation of my own students, but I think that logic, which is the logic of tuition fees, the logic of the debt that pays for tuition fees, is generating a culture of anxiety in which people are just terrified of the mere passage of time. The time starts to take on a kind of tyrannical form, where the sense that one has wasted one's time, one has not used one's time properly, becomes sort of overbearing. And there is and I mentioned this in the abstract of my talk, well, I haven't really ended up talking about it very much, but maybe we can later. But, I mean, the most striking phenomenon that I and colleagues in other universities have seen on campuses over the last few years has been the rise of, everyone talks about the student mental health crisis, but it's anxiety, it's a type of anxiety in which students simply find coming to the campus or entering the exam hall or the seminar room brings them out in a type of panic, a sense that they can carry on with their work. Some of them get good marks at the end of it, actually, by never coming in at all, other than for exams. But I think that the sense of these spaces as being things that generate this type of panicky reaction is something that I think cannot be totally dissociated from the way in which a university has been separate. University is now anchored in a logic of where you are going to be in 30 years' time. This is how the entire justification for the fees and the debt works. And then finally, and this is I think where the whole thing kind of falls apart ideologically and morally, is that the intergenerational dimensions of it. In order for competition to be seen as a legitimate basis for the sorting of the wheat from the chaff, there has to be a sense that the starting line is equal. That's how sport works. That's how board games work, or whatever it might be. There has to be a sense that the starting line is roughly equal. That is the ideology of meritocracy, and it has a certain appeal to it. But I think that what we're seeing as neoliberal forms of policy develop, as inequality develops, is that the family is becoming the main transmitter of increasingly divergent economic chances. And the work of Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, which was this sort of shock bestseller about inequality that came out in 2014, shows that fundamentally capitalism no longer rewards things, all of the things that Margaret Thatcher said capitalism should reward: hard work, effort, going it alone, trying to become an owner, an investor, and an entrepreneur. But actually, Piketty's work shows that capitalism is far more generous to people who have been born into wealth, to people who happen to have got lucky from when they were born, in terms of generational inequalities, happen to have got lucky from particular assets that have appreciated far more than others, and that actually capitalism is rewarding some people for doing very little at all. So in that sense, I think that this whole ideology starts to fall apart in quite powerful ways, and that really explains the sort of interregnum that we're currently in. So I'm going to stop